Ravi Zacharias is a very famous apologist and Christian speaker who's been to countries I've never even heard of defending the gospel. And back in February, he basically went under emergency spinal surgery in an attempt to heal the intense back pain that he had been dealing with for a number of years. Although the surgery itself was considered a success, he was still dealing with an excruciating amount of pain, and it was later realized that he had been dealing with a malignant tumor, a rare form of cancer known as sarcoma. So, right away they put him under treatment, and although the original cancer tumor was responding to the chemotherapy, the other areas to which the cancer had spread were behaving very aggressively, leaving the medical team that was behind him out of viable options in terms of what they could do. So, as of a few days ago, he was sent back to his home in Atlanta, where he could spend what remaining time he has left with those close to him. Now, maybe you've heard of Ravi, maybe you haven't, but for those of you who have, this has raised a lot of emotions. I myself, to be honest with you, wasn't exactly in a joyous mood when I first heard about it. I just finished college on Wednesday, and as I think back to these past 3 years, I realized how indebted I am to Ravi Zacharias International Ministries and the work that they've done, and not just impacting me as an intellectual, but as a follower of Christ. When I was in college, I wasn't exactly in an environment where a Christian could fit in, so to speak, and so at times when I'd be alone in my apartment or whatever the situation was, I listened to talks from people like Ravi Zacharias, Abdu Murray, Vince Vitale, and others who were part of the team. And, I didn't realize it as much in the moment, but looking back here and now and seeing this, I'm indebted. I'm really indebted to them. And so even though I've never met Ravi personally, losing him almost kind of feels like it would be like losing a lifelong friend, if that makes sense, because it was through his work and through his ministry that I was able to find that community I had been longing for in college, albeit in an indirect way. But we're Christians. And while for most of the world their story would end there, for us it's really just the beginning. I was listening to David Wood's testimony the other day, and he said something that really stuck out to me. I've coined it as the resurrection standard. Take a listen.
And didn't know much at this time, kept reading the Bible. And so I became a Christian. But notice, I was 20 years old, and as far as I could tell, my entire life was ruined. I was already a convicted violent felon. I had years left to serve in prison. The psychiatrist there was trying to have me sent to Miriam, which would have been my third mental hospital, because, again, they were thinking that I'd finally snapped. Doctor was threatening to tube feed me, and I was a Christian. So I was right with God, and I had peace, but what else is there, right? I've already ruined my life. And there's just one problem with that thinking. I now believed in a God who raised Jesus from the dead. And that sort of starts a process of what we might call resurrection thinking. Resurrection thinking should be not only the heart of apologetics, but the heart of the Christian life. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the worst thing that could possibly happen happened. The worst thing that could happen happened. If I were to ask someone today, what's the worst thing that could happen? It might be, my child dying or something like that. There are actually worse things that can happen. Namely, the creator of the universe, who sustains us for every moment of our existence, entering the world and putting himself at the mercy of sinful creatures to torture and kill him. And if he happens to be the Messiah as well, the one who's supposed to bring peace to the world, and he dies, well, now there goes our hope as well. So that's the worst thing that could happen. And yet, 3 days later, Jesus rises, and we find out that the worst thing that could possibly happen was actually the greatest thing that could ever happen. What was the worst thing that could ever happen actually turned out to be the thing that reconciles God and sinful human beings. And so it was the greatest thing that ever happened. And that had a massive impact on the early Christians. You take someone like the Apostle Paul. Paul persecuted the church. And when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, keep in mind, from Paul's perspective, when he hits the ground and Jesus says, I'm the one you've been persecuting, he's convinced that Jesus is there for judgment, right? You've been persecuting the church, and now it's over. I'm here to destroy you. That's what Paul would be thinking on the ground. But Jesus doesn't say, you've been persecuting me, and now I have to destroy you. He says, get up. Paul's life was not over. Paul's life was just getting started. And he was impacted by that kind of thing and by the resurrection. So much so that even years later, it didn't matter what happened to him. This was a guy who was, he received the 39 lashes 5 different times. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was shipwrecked multiple times. They tried to stone him to death. He survived. Every sort of abuse you could heap on someone, this guy had it. And yet, he could say, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed.
And so what can we take away from this? As horrible and as devastating the situation surrounding Ravi is, it's not the worst thing that could happen. As David himself essentially said, the worst thing that could happen did happen nearly 2,000 years ago. And it was through God himself that this worst thing became the greatest blessing that the world has ever known. And with all of this in mind, as difficult as it is to see everything going on, not just in relation to Ravi, but with the entire world and, viruses and pandemics and all this chaos, we can be confident that God can turn it around and use it for the better. And so Ravi, if by some miracle you end up seeing this video or someone in your team ends up seeing this video, I just want to personally say God bless you and thank you for everything that you've done, because you are another prime example after a long list of heroes that God can take one person and transform the entire world. Until we meet again, brother.